Is it wrong to have doubts about God? The psalmists questioned God about the unfairness of life. They arrived at their answers based on observation of God's creation and his self-revelation in word and deed. They believed the evidence. Is there anything wrong with questioning what we have been taught to believe about God and Christianity? If it is true, will it stand up to scrutiny? Should we look to the evidence? Or should we let our feelings and cultural pressures apart from the Bible be the gauge for determining what is Christian and what is not? Thank you for joining our discussion about the deconstruction of Christianity.
And welcome as we do our final session tonight on the deconstruction of Christianity, the book by Alyssa Childers and Tim Barnett. And I am going to do this. So yeah, and here's everybody. Everybody is arrived, whatever it is. They're here. And that's exciting news. What are we doing tonight? Well, this section is called Hope. And they really have 3 chapters here. We're going to kind of condense it down to one session because the hope comes into a very important part, and that is God calls people to him. And even though they may have left for a temporary time, I would say for some of them at least it will be temporary, I think he calls them back. In fact, this section opens with a story of Dave Stovell, who traveled with 2 Christian bands, and he grew up in a conservative church, which seems to be probably was a legalistic one. And he gives us a little bit of his story here. He writes, I was taught that tattoos and alcohol were sinful, and that if you didn't believe God created the universe in 7 consecutive 24-hour days, or that the rapture would happen before the tribulation, then you probably weren't truly saved. After reading the study and studying the Bible for himself, he realized that these issues weren't so cut and dried. Later, after he read books by Rob Bell and listened to progressive Christian podcast, he basically deconstructed is what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as you read his story, what sort of things would stick out to you to say, here is how he got sidetracked?
Well, number one, they were giving him really, I guess you could say the secondary issues were becoming primary issues, for one, because they were using these as to claim salvation was an issue with these particular topics, which they're not. So, you know, and so the second part is that he began listening to Rob Bell.
Yes. So
how was he supposed to know that?
Right. Well,
right. So that's the third thing. Who taught him how to have discernment?
Yeah. Apparently not anybody.
How to even ask the right questions. So as I read this, I thought, okay, he thought he was rejecting Christianity in the Bible. He was in doubt about what the important but secondary issues are, and he was unaware of Rob Bell's progressivism in his walking away.
Exactly.
And so because he hadn't really been taught things like, I don't know, logic, reasoning, asking good questions, or reading the Bible in context, in its historical, grammatical context, or that these issues are important to our church. This is in our statement of faith, but they are not salvific.
Right.
And so to a young mind, how would they distinguish between the timing of the rapture versus the deity of Christ? How would they know that there's one's really more important than the other?
Right. They really wouldn't. You know what I find interesting is that sentence that says, after reading and studying the Bible for himself, you realize that these issues that they had told him, that were when you weren't saved if you didn't believe this, weren't as cut and dry as they made it seem. That part he got right, but then he went downhill from there.
Donald and I haven't really discussed this because it's important to him, it's important to me, but it's not of central importance. We might not agree, and
Right.
we don't really care. But, I don't know what Don's full view is on eschatology. Is there a pre-trib rapture or
Neither
something
does
else?
he.
Pardon?
Neither does he. He's not quite there yet.
He's not quite there yet. Okay.
Some of us aren't either. So.
Well,
I'm pro-millennial. I'm in favor of it happening.
There you go.
okay. and me, I am like so pre-trib, I don't need post-hosties. But a lot of that, and Jeff and I have had this kind of discussion, and James and I, a lot of that, frankly, comes down to some other kinds of questions, in my opinion,
Right.
and that is your view of when the church began, because then that starts answering other questions like your eschatology, for example. Your
Sure.
beginning kind of determines your ending.
Mhm.
Now, could I be wrong on that? Absolutely. Because God hasn't, I wish he would, but he somehow didn't send me this greeting card to say, here's the truth about eschatology.
Oh no.
I've been looking for that, but every day I check the mail and Joy asks me, did we get $1 million? And I think, did we get the answer on eschatology? And both of us are let down.
Isn't that sad?
Ron Hensel, who I love dearly, we've worked together for well over 30 years, is mill, probably. He's not even completely settled on that. Okay. Again, it is not salvific.
Right.
And unfortunately, these are the things that sort of break the bank of faith
Mhm.
for some Christians who are deconstructing.
Yep.
I have a question because this comes up a lot, and I never hear people talk about this. It'd be speculation, but I'd like to hear maybe what you have to say, Dr. Williams, about some of these issues that aren't important to your salvation, but they're still important to understand maybe, but people understand them differently. Great people that have studied them, So why do you think, how do you make sense, or have you thought of, why did God leave this unclear? It's obviously not perfectly clear. Some people think they got it, but why do you think God did that?
Let me answer that question by telling you a story. When I was in seminary, I had a job as a caretaker of a mansion of this nouveau riche couple on the north shore of Lake Michigan. I got a apartment in the mansion. I got room and board and $100 a week for taking care of the place, and then I could do it on my own schedule, so I could be in seminary full time. And that was for a while how I paid for seminary. Well, these guys went to Europe for a week, and I knew the day and the hour of the master's return because I was supposed to pick them up at O'Hare in their fancy car. So guess how I spent that week? For 6 days of it, I lived like a rich guy. I was swimming in their pool. I was playing their expensive stereo. I was playing pool in their billiards room. And then the last day before they got back, I had this flurry of frantic activity doing all this work I was supposed to have been doing the whole week. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So that taught me something. It taught me the reason why Jesus made sure we could, not that we didn't, but we could not know the day and the hour. Why? Because Jesus ain't stupid. He knows exactly what we would do with that information. And so a lot of eschatology is on a need to know basis, and we don't need to know.
Right.
Exactly.
What we need to do is be faithful. We need to understand that the basic message of Revelation is God's going to win.
Right.
And, the details are not determining anything we should be doing. We should be preaching the gospel. We should be good
Right.
stewards. We should
Regardless.
be teaching our families. We should be doing all these things uh, in such a way that if Jesus comes back today, he finds us at our post. If he comes back 1,000 years from now, we've prepared for that too. That's the way he wants us to live. And so I think the level of specificity that is possible in eschatology is by design less than our curiosity wants it to be,
Mm-hmm.
because it's there for practical reasons to give us the context of being faithful. We know we don't have forever.
Right.
It's finite. The amount of time in our future is finite. I don't have forever to witness to that neighbor. I don't have forever to forgive that person.
Right.
I don't have forever to do any of the things that God has called me to do. Yeah. Just about any view of eschatology you have, it tells you that, which is what you need to know, is we need to be faithful. We need to be occupying until the Lord returns. And yeah, I think the level of specificity that is possible in our understanding of the end times is made less than our curiosity wants by design, because Jesus ain't stupid.
Right. I completely agree.
Absolutely.
I also think that it gives us the opportunity, because God created us in his own image. Now, he knows all things. He doesn't have to learn things, but we need to learn things. And part of the process of debating issues like eschatology, like when did the church begin, sharpens our mind and our focus on theological questions.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to be careful what we commit to as being sacrosanct. I'm not letting
Yeah.
go of this no matter what.
Right.
Because God sometimes will break your fingers if it's something not essential.
Right. Right.
Right?
That's for sure.
So you want to be careful what you hold on to. Now, his story I found fascinating because it sort of mimics Joy's story a little bit, and then how I came to the faith is he and his wife had a child.
Mm-hmm.
So he deconstructed. He's been 10 years living, he thought, the life of Riley, no big God to have to answer to, doesn't have to worry about a big thumb in the sky coming down and squash him like a bug. Life is going to be good. And then his child was born, and suddenly he goes, wait a minute, what am I going to teach this youngster? There's something that's true, and I need to know what it is to tell them. The second thing that happened as a result of that, which should have happened in his youth, is he met up with a pastor.
Mm-hmm.
A pastor who was willing to take hard questions and be his friend and have lunch and disagree on some issues and talk about other issues and ask and learn, what does the Bible really teach? And so this pastor discipled him back into the faith. Similar thing happened with Joy. We had our son. He woke up in the hospital with two big questions. She didn't like either one of them. The first was, are they really sending this child home with me? I don't know anything about raising children. The answer to that was, yes, they are. The second one was, what am I going to teach him? Because she has was a Christian, but kind of it fell off the radar, especially after being married to me and for, at that point, 3 years, and dating before that. And I was, not a believer, and lived pretty consistently with not being a believer. And so she had a lot of ground to cover, and she kind of challenged God. Her sister gave her some books. She read them. She rededicated her life to Christ, asked me to read them. I thought, I'll humor her, because if she wants something really badly, she's going to get it anyway. So just give it early. And I can read it and then blow it off and say I did that and it's just stupid. Unfortunately, or fortunately, actually, fortunately for me,
Right.
I came to realize I couldn't know God didn't exist. That's a claim I cannot know. I thought I could be an agnostic. That's not a claim to know anything. It's a claim to say, I don't know anything. But that was unsatisfactory because I like knowing stuff. And so I followed the trail of the Christian faith, how it came about, is the Bible reliable, those kinds of big questions. And I ended up becoming a Christian as a result of that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's answers out there, which then kind of takes me to the next little phase here in the whole question of hope, and that is ask questions and do fact checking. We hear a lot about fact checking today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really important aspect of this whole thing. Ask questions and do fact checking. Just because someone has a really good story doesn't mean it is a really true story.
Yeah, that is very
Right?
true. Yep.
That's even true of pastors. I love pastors.
Mhm.
I really do love pastors. But we have and James, you've read a lot of our stuff, and others have read our
Mhm.
material. Joy and I write together. We write together for a reason. We enjoy each other's company. We bounce off of each other with different ideas. She has a better sense of humor than I have in writing. She's a very good storyteller. And she invents things we call joyisms. And so in one article, we were talking about this kind of an issue. And she said, which I still use sometimes, just because the pastor said it from the pulpit doesn't mean how does she put it? Oh, yeah. Just because the pastor said it from the pulpit doesn't mean it isn't really stupid.
Yeah.
Some things are really stupid.
Mhm.
But we don't think about that because it's the pastor. He wouldn't say something stupid from the pulpit. Of course he would, because you know what? He's human. I would. I do sometimes, and I get called on it, and I should be. Now, see, I can't hear Jeff, and I'm glad because I know he's talking about me now.
Or he's thinking it one way or the other.
No, his mouth was moving. His
Oh,
mic
that's
is
all
off.
right.
So,
That's all right.
yeah. So, and I am prone to error sometimes because I like having fun with things, and sometimes to say something goes, yeah, I probably shouldn't have said that one. Yeah. Especially because in the pulpit you're dealing with people's lives,
Sure.
so you want to be accurate in what you're conveying.
Mhm.
So we need to know how to answer big questions. That's our task as those in leadership roles or more mature. Uh, and I know, for example, I know that John and Krista work really hard to try to find the correct answers. They're
Mhm.
not always the correct answers, but one of the things they've learned about them is they're willing to be corrected. Jeff, I give up on Jeff. No.
We all do. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no. Jeff is always
He's
full of
got
questions.
questions. That's good.
Yeah, well, we'll be in our adult ed classic. We did the last of Don Williams' book,
Oh,
95 Thesis, this past Sunday.
nice.
And Jeff is always the one who sometimes, but somehow right in the middle of our Pastor Wexick eloquent on something, go, I have a question. And Pastor Dan will stop and he'll ask the question. Well, then they have to talk through what the
Yeah.
question really is, what it means, and then it'll get answered.
Right.
Sometimes by somebody else in the room, because we like to have that exchange of ideas. So ask big questions, and we need to be prepared to answer big questions.
Mhm.
There's other life questions that are being asked as well that I think are at least directed by the scripture. They're not necessarily directly answered, but to give us a layout. For example, what kind of a career should I follow? Should I marry? And if so, who should I marry? Is there one person on the planet that God has chosen for me to marry? That's a good question. I get that a
Mm.
lot.
Oh, I'm sure.
What do you think, James?
Is there somebody? Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
Because it a lot of people, I guess, have the idea that God is there to micromanage our lives,
Yes.
and it's not necessarily so. Sometimes He does intervene, even in the small things.
Sometimes he does. Yeah.
The small things or the big things, it depends. But
Yeah.
that's not the normative. The normative, if you have enough Word of God in you, and you have a brain that thinks logically enough, you should be able to decipher and discern and say, hey, this person, we match up pretty good. And then you take the time to know that person. And that's going to tell you whether that person is for you or not, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. The way I tell it, and because I've had this question come up a lot on jobs, on marriage, on should I move to another state?
Right.
If you live in Illinois, the answer is yes. Uh,
I did.
you did
God
it.
told me to. No, I'm just kidding.
Is when my kids were younger, we lived on 1 acre. We rented a house in Lombard, 1 acre.
Yes.
And on that 1 acre, we had a very long driveway. We had a swing set. We had
That was a nice place.
sandbox. So I had a gigantic rose garden, if you remember that, James.
Yeah, that's
We
beautiful.
had. I mean, there's a lot of different things you could do,
Yeah.
and Jennifer would come into the house sometimes and go, "Dad, I'm bored. What should I do?" And I would say, "Well, okay, you can go and play in the sandbox. You can go on a swing set. You can ride your bike up and down the driveway. Here's what you cannot do. You cannot cross the street.
Right.
Period. End of discussion."
Mhm.
So I had one thing that she needed to know. You cannot do this. But everything within the boundaries of the yard, you can do.
Mhm.
So when someone comes to me and says, who should I marry, for example, and I think I shared this a few weeks back. I had in one of our house churches, I had a young woman come up to me with a 4-page list,
Oh yeah.
typewritten, every line, on the qualifications for her future husband.
Nice.
And she asked me if I would look at it and give her my opinion, and I took it and I kind of leafed through it and I looked at it and I said, "Well, you're going to be an old maid." And she said, "What do you mean? I've been to all these, how to find a husband seminars in Christian churches and stuff, and this is what she told me to do." She goes, "What would you do?" I said, "What you do is this. It's a lot easier.
Throw that away.
You can make a list of all the things you cannot stand in a person and don't marry them.
There you go.
It is easier than you expect."
Mhm.
Because everyone you do think about marrying, there's going to be problems. And part of that is because there's problems with you, because we're sinners.
Yeah.
And so when you marry, you're committing to work through the problems of life together. So is there a single person out there that God created just for you that maybe is living in Russia that you'll never meet? No, probably not. God gives you options. And the question is this: can you marry this person and glorify me? Can you marry this person and glorify me? Can you marry this person and glorify me? Yes, yes, no. Okay, don't marry that one. Pick one of these other two. You're good with that.
Right.
What about a job? Do I have to be a mechanic, or can I be a carpenter, or maybe I want to be a banker? Okay. Can you glorify me as a carpenter? Can you glorify me as a mechanic? Can you glorify me as a banker? If the answer is yes, then take your pick. What do you want to do?
Mhm.
Right? He gives us options, and we tend to not realize that because we're not trained that way in church. We have a relationship with God.
Yes.
And within that relationship, he has a specific will, and then he has a less specific will where he's overseeing what you're going to do. And he's going to use you sometimes in spite of your choices, not because of them.
Exactly.
So while you're waxing eloquent, can I ask a question?
Oh,
No.
here we go.
Yes.
How is this relating to the deconstruction? What are people deconstructing over relative to this topic? I'm just curious.
Well, they're deconstructing over the view that God has everything orchestrated in their life, and if they miss His will, He's going to step right down on them.
So Dan and I went over a book. I don't know. I can't quote the book right now, but it was about knowing God's will, and regarding making decisions, because that's challenging for me. And I think the thing is, if you're committed to God, a lot of times you do your best to see what the Bible says, make your decision. He can use you, whether you move to Denver or you stay in Illinois. It's that God can use you,
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
knowing his will is,
Right.
You know,
And see, so this is decision making is a big thing, and it's not taught. Don and I have talked about this in a lot of different ways all the way through this. Is the things that are not taught often enough in church are read the Bible in context,
mhm.
right? Historical grammatical context. Know who God is and how He works in your life. Know what the big doctrines are that are non-negotiable, and realize that the other ones are,
Yeah.
important, but you might disagree with someone else.
Mhm.
Um, Making decisions comes into the same category because is God going to be offended by you making one choice over another? No. Now, here's the other big questions. The four big ones: origins, meaning, morality, and destiny. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Why should I live in a particular way at all? And where am I going when I die?
Mhm.
Now, those shape your worldview. Again, these are things that are really core to be teaching young people, especially
Yeah.
because they have a lot of people in their peer group around them offering them other answers to these questions
Mhm.
without you even realizing it's coming. So we have, in fact, this week we're talking a little bit about intellectual osmosis. Uh, I like intellectual osmosis. I don't like
Yeah.
it actually, but it's the fact of life.
Mhm.
Where your worldview is shaped by ideas you hear from your peer group, from the television, from the movies, from the books you read, from the magazines you read, from the, I don't know, music you listen to. Uh, you have a constant stream of information coming into your brain. You don't have a gate to check it to say, no, no, no. So when I actually go teach like at high school stuff where I'm teaching worldviews, I teach the worldviews, and then we watch a film. Hidalgo is the one I pick, and I point out every movie you watch has a worldview.
Mhm.
It is the worldview of the writer, the director, whatever, but it is a
Right.
worldview,
Mhm.
and you may not pick it up unless you look for it. And in Hidalgo, you have three actual worldviews being played out in there. Uh, and one of them is Islam, one of them is Christian, and one of them is animistic, American Indian.
Mhm.
Uh, and so, which one is the best worldview? Well, as it turns out, animism is the best worldview. Which is the most honest worldview? Well, it's Islam in that film.
Mhm.
Uh, which is the least reliable and honest worldview? Christianity is how they played it.
Right.
Right. So, but if you didn't know what to look for, you wouldn't have picked it up because it's a very interesting movie. So, and that goes to these questions of meaning, morality, destiny, origin, because they kind of play out in a lot of these different films.
Mhm.
Same thing with um, the Matrix.
Mhm.
You know, did you come from inside a computer program, or is it real? And
Right.
how do you make your decisions about life based on those kinds of questions?
Red pill, blue pill. You know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'll take the blue pill, I think. Take the blue pill.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
About 59% of Christian young people walk away from the faith by the time they're 15,
Mhm.
according to Barna. I think that that's probably accurate. But that's not the end of the story because some of them do come back.
Mhm. Mhm.
Does the church provide opportunities for Q&A sessions? Now, this is whole question
Mhm.
about hope. This is where this road comes around, Jeff. Why is this important? I know James read the book. James, why is having Q&A sessions opportunities at church important?
Oh man, those are awesome. If every church had that, that'd be great. It gives opportunity for people to come up and ask, sometimes the hard questions and really hopefully get the answers they need. The sad part would be if they are at a church that doesn't give them the right answers, then you really, but
Well, one of the things that they point out here, which I think that strikes me as a good way to handle it, is you're not doing a Q&A session in the middle of the worship service and teaching time.
right afterwards.
All right. You've done church. Now you're basically done your farewell. See you later. If you're hanging around to ask questions, we're going to start up in 5 minutes or whatever.
Right.
And then you can have a 40-minute session. At least this is how the late Tim Keller apparently did it. A 40-minute session each Sunday after the main
Mhm.
message, where you could just, spitball, ask questions, do answers, talk through issues, whatever. Uh, that is really helpful because it gives people, let's say Morgan was in my church and she had a question. Now, she might not raise her hand during the sermon, but wouldn't it be a good idea to have an opportunity for her and her friends to go stand up afterwards and go, okay, you said this. I don't understand it, or I don't agree with it, or anything like that, where you can actually talk these things through.
Mhm.
That'd be a wonderful idea.
And
say what?
would be. She said
That'd
that'd
be
be
a
wonderful.
great idea.
Yeah, wonderful. And you would have a lot of questions. I know that.
It's
Go ahead, Don. You look like you want to say something there.
I mean, obviously, providing answers is important, but the very fact that you're not afraid to do it is communicating something about your attitude toward questions and your confidence in the ability of the Bible to provide answers to them.
Mhm.
And I think that's as important as the answers themselves,
Yes.
because the thing that almost drove me away from the faith when I was in high school was not so much that people couldn't answer my questions, it was the attitude toward the question.
exactly.
Now, if you were spiritual, you wouldn't be asking that.
Oh.
You just need to read your Bible more and pray harder
Ooh.
and just believe. And I'm like, okay, if these guys are so insecure that they're frightened
Right.
and freaked out by the questions of a snot-nosed teenager, how can what they're telling me possibly be true?
Exactly.
And fortunately, I, in the providence of God, I found C.S. Lewis, I found Francis Schaeffer, I found people that could give me the answers and that could just make it okay to have a brain that works, and be a Christian.
Mhm.
And this guy that we started out with, he's in a church where they're encouraging him to make no distinction between the baby and the bathwater.
Right.
And it's not shocking then that at a certain point he throws the whole thing out. I would too. Anybody with any sense would.
Right.
And fortunately, Jesus is real, and he draws people back who actually know him.
Yeah.
But we set people up to have these problems.
Mhm.
So I love the idea of having this thing as part of your routine at church because of what it communicates just by being there.
Yes.
Exactly.
Over
Communicates
and above the actual
Mhm.
answers that you may be.
right.
Yeah.
Right. It answers questions on multiple fronts, but I think the two most important are, of course, what do we believe and why do we believe it? But are you in the right church to begin with? And then if you're not sure, you pray for that discernment, and God will lead you to where you need to be. It's just being bold enough to get up and move if you have to move.
I was recently reading a book by a Christian author, and there's this one scene where they're have basically teacher student meeting or whatever with all the kids at this school that the story takes place at, And one of the kids basically asks the question of like, is the Jesus figure of the book like real? Like, how do we know that he's alive? You know, if he died for us and blah blah blah. And the teacher and main character's response is basically, you can feel him. You just need to have faith.
Mm.
And I read that and I just started screaming into a pillow because it's like, you basically just told this kid to shut up.
Yeah.
And that is unfortunately what happens in a lot of these churches, even if they do have Q&A sessions, like at my last church, is if they don't know the answer, they might tell you to have faith or they'll just nicely tiptoe around it. And yeah, if that happens, then no wonder a bunch of teenagers are seeing that and being like, ugh, this is just, why am I here?
Well, it was answering basically the most important question is, are you in the right church?
Yeah.
Are you where you need to be?
That'll tell you right there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is, I can't emphasize this enough, and I think Don W. feels the same way about this, is if people have questions, they need a way to attempt to have them answered. It doesn't mean we're going to have answers to every question.
Right.
And I find at least that they don't expect you to have answers to every question, but they do expect, A, that you listen to the question. B, if you have an answer, you'll help them walk through it. C, if you don't have an answer, that you will, at least I do, say, let me check into it. In fact, sometimes even Andre, you don't know Andre,
Mhm.
James
Oh,
don't
yeah.
know him. He calls me virtually every day.
Yeah.
Andre's an amazing guy to me. He's blind. He reads more than any two-sighted people that I know, and he
Mhm.
reads in Braille. And he'll call me. It's less these days about context, but it used to be, what does this passage mean? Now he's smart enough to know that I'm going to go, what's the context?
Yeah.
Right? Because
Yeah.
invested a lot of time in him teaching him about context. And he called me up one time and he asked me about a passage in Matthew 7. And I said, well, did you read the context? And he goes, yes, but I don't really get it. I said, that's because you didn't start at the beginning of the context. He goes, what do you mean? I go, there's no chapter markers in the original writings.
Right.
Chapter 7 context starts in chapter 5.
Mhm.
So if you want the answer to this question here in 7, you got to go back to chapter 5 to find out where the question began, which is where it is here. And we walked you through it. That's part of the process of answering questions, saying, here's the question, here's how to find answers for yourself. That's
Right.
one. We're going to take you seriously because you're a serious person on questions. Second, and you've raised this issue, is sometimes you're punished for asking questions. You're ridiculed in some way,
Mhm.
which makes you not want to ask questions because you don't want to be made to feel stupid.
Mhm.
I don't know that there's a stupid question. Maybe there is. I haven't run into one yet because it's a question that somebody has that they really want to get answered.
Mhm.
Um, or they're given bad answers. That happens too often, and that comes from someone trying to make up a question on the spur of the moment. Don't do that.
Right.
I mean, I get every single day an email or a phone call about one question or another question, and pretty often I have to say, okay, let me look at the context of the passage with you and work through the answer if it's a biblical question. Uh, because I don't want to go just off the top of my head. I could have it wrong
Mhm.
in my giving it. Doesn't mean I don't know what the answer is. It means I am misthinking it or something.
Mhm.
And reading it out loud and talking it through helps me to answer questions that way. And
Mhm.
it teaches them again how to search for answers themselves. Now, I've
Right.
I've told you the story about Danny before, haven't I? About
Mhm.
Danny from
Mhm.
Cortez. Yeah. Danny was like this. She grew up in this little town. She ended up going to like every church in town during her growing up years, and
Mhm.
then got involved with the Urantia book.
Mhm.
And the reason is really simple. She loves questions. She loves knowledge. She asks questions.
Mhm.
And repeatedly she was told, "Oh, Danny, you just want to argue," or uh, "Oh, you just have to take it by faith," or any number of things, or bad answers. And
Mhm.
so she just came to the conclusion that they don't have answers.
Mm-hmm.
And she ran into this person, so that's reading the Urantia book.
Mm-hmm.
Small cult, very techno cult,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of space alien sorts of things,
Angels and stuff. Yeah.
angels and stuff. Yeah, and 179,000 Jesus, I think. Uh,
Yeah, somewhere
and
around there.
yeah, something like that. 179,000 Jesuses, and there's the one Jesus for this planet.
Yeah.
The planet Urantia,
Yeah.
according to the book. And it fascinated her because it gave her answers to questions like, who's Melchizedek?
Ah.
So as we started talking about it and talked about worldviews, which really got her on a different trajectory,
Mm-hmm.
and then Melchizedek came up and she said, well, they gave me answers. I go, yes, but they weren't true answers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to make a comment
Yeah.
about what Krista said about maybe not being in the right church. So recently I've run into this. This has been interesting, but what I wanted to say is, we all have different gifts. We all have different interests. And there's a
Mhm.
balance between, an intellectual pursuit of the gospel and somebody
Right.
that has more of a heart that wants to do more of a worship and grace oriented and doesn't care so much about the details. So sometimes if you're in a church that doesn't fit your exact makeup and it doesn't work well, the thing is, you can look around for a different church that fits you better, maybe, as opposed to going off and just leaving altogether. So,
Well, it's a process. You shouldn't just up and go. I mean, you have to do your research. Like
so a
we did
couple
that, so.
examples. This gets to things in the Bible that there's people that believe on both sides. So if we look at the sovereignty of God and the free will of man, some churches, they're heavy on the sovereignty of God and some are less heavy. They're both, with the essentials of salvation, and they can be good Bible teaching churches, but, one might not fit. The other one is there's a lot of issues, right? Another one is the apostolic gifts. And some people that are in a church that, if the apostolic gifts kind of ceased back then and another person's has some experience and they're not comfortable with that, they could find another church that might fit them that still will teach biblical teaching, is what I'm saying. So, people are deconstructing because, like Krista said, you can find a church that fits you better and still is biblical. I don't know how to make that point. Maybe one of you can.
Well,
just because their questions aren't answered, don't just completely ditch the church. Just wash your hands and be like, I'm done. I mean, be honest. I've been there.
Yeah.
And actually, I was there, and that's why I did leave the church. I was in it for 20 years, and then I went into the New Age for another 20 years. And when I came back, I was drawn to what I had known, which was a lot of deception in the church, until I started asking a lot of questions, and a lot of pastors didn't have those answers.
Mhm.
And God provided the right church that we needed to be in. And
Yeah.
sometimes the church that we needed to be in wasn't the best church at all, but we were there for a reason. Maybe it was to kind of get the pastor thinking about something. So it all is for the glory of God, even when it stinks, even when it's hard.
Yeah. I think there's go ahead, John.
When I first came to the faith, I was under the mistaken impression that all Protestant churches were pretty much like McDonald's, and they're all basically the same thing. One on that block is the same as this one. And, the Catholics, they're more like Burger King, and the Mormons, they're Taco Bell. But you get the point. But we went to the first church. It was a seeker-sensitive church, and it didn't work out. And I'm glad I didn't give up. I'm glad we went to another church.
Yes.
And then when that one didn't work out, we went to another church. But we kept searching. I've actually become quite adept at searching for churches because we live in an area where it's hard to find a good church. But we found one. And you just got to keep searching. Don't give up on Jesus.
Right.
I'm afraid that area is called the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and no church is perfect.
No.
That's been a real hard pill for me to swallow, because one of the hardest things for me to understand, trying to see what is the church like really? Like, how should it function the
Right.
way it is explained in the Bible? You know, why isn't it all exactly the same? Why are there so many differences? You know, because if you look at cults, or even in the New Age, even though it's just a mixed bag of beliefs, you expect that mixed bag of beliefs, and people pick and choose. But you all know, like, you have the
Central
similar
point.
seeking. I want spirituality. I want to,
Mhm.
you're a spiritual gold digger. You just keep looking and looking.
Yeah.
You all have something super in common. But it seems to me like when I first really started looking for a solid church, you know, there are just so many differences. I couldn't understand the essentials of the faith.
Right. Right.
Because everybody fought about, you know, baptism or music or this or that. And that was just so super confusing. It's like, well, if they can't even get their act together, why even bother?
Well,
It's not
right.
about that.
Yeah.
It is about the essentials, and it's about who Jesus is and what the gospel
Yes.
really is. And are they preaching that? Are you hearing it? Are you actually hearing it?
Mhm.
Yeah, so no church is perfect. You keep trying, and people are human, and so you're going to run into all kinds of things, even
Mhm.
in the best church.
Yeah, I like what John said. Don't give up on Jesus just because you haven't found your church yet. Keep looking. So that's great, John.
Yes.
Well,
Absolutely.
and that's really true. And many times deconstructors are deconstructing from a faith that we wouldn't believe either,
Mhm.
because they have a false view of faith. It's there's occasions when I'll talk to someone who's deconstructing who has a fairly reasonable understanding of the doctrines of the church, but mostly they don't.
Mhm.
And one of my very early questions is to ask them to describe to me who God is. Tell me what it is that you are deconstructing from, and then almost not all the time, but almost all the time, once they describe the God they're running from or the Christianity that they're leaving, I go, I'm going with you because I don't believe in that Jesus either.
Mhm.
I don't believe in that understanding of Scripture either. Uh, there's other answers to these questions. Are you willing to talk about them? Some are. In some cases, they're doing it because they believe they're going to be able to challenge you on your belief and perhaps be an evangelist to get you out of the church. There's some of that.
Mhm.
But then they kind of discover that there are actual answers that are different than the answers that they thought they were given in whatever setting they grew up in.
Mm-hmm.
So that means for us, take our time, listen to what they're saying, ask them good questions, listen. And we talked a lot about this in Greg Kuchel's book, for example. Uh,
Mhm.
listen to their answers because they're going to tell you what it is that you need to know and to learn if you don't know. I get when I get parents that call me up because their adult child got involved in a cult or their spouse joined a different group or something. Um, what do I do? They want the silver bullet. You know, what silver bullet verse
Mhm.
do I give them to get them
Mhm.
out? And I have to say, it doesn't exist.
Mhm.
You have to do the work of learning the faith yourself so you can ask questions. And you have to ask them questions as opportunities arise in such a way that they can think about the question without feeling threatened.
Don, you brought up two words that really helped me. I have a friend that's struggling with some false teaching, and he's really going a little off the rails. And Don talked to him, and Don mentioned to me that he's both indoctrinated and he's invested. And I think
Mhm.
that's kind of what happens maybe when people are deconstructing. They close their mind and they're, sure that things aren't working. They don't understand it, but they don't even want to try anymore.
Right. It depends how far down the road they are. Yeah. For
Right.
sure. For
Yeah.
sure.
It does, and because they're there now, see that's the thing is when we panic because we think that whatever decision they made now is going to be that decision for the next 40 years of their life if they live
Mhm.
that long. maybe, but perhaps it's just a stopping point.
Right.
You know, I often go back to, in fact, I did this a lot with when my son was a teenager. I used to read the prodigal son story like every day. It wasn't that my son left physically, but it's kind of like he came home when he turned 15 and he said, "Well, mom, dad, I'm going." And we said, "Where?" And he said, "I'm going bad." Uh, he didn't actually say that, but that's kind of what happened. And so we stayed with him. We loved him in spite of how he's behaving. We prayed for him. In fact, Joy's method is pray for your kid every day. Get your family and friends to pray for your kid every day. Get perfect strangers walking down the street to pray for your kid every day. You know, you invest yourself in praying, and God will work in that individual's life.
Yeah.
In the meantime, you're preparing. That's the second part of it. You're preparing because when they ask a question, you want to be able to float out a response and then let go of it. That's the hardest thing. We want to ask a question and stand there and wait, stare at them until they answer.
Yeah.
No, I call it a question and a croissant. Ask the question, offer them a croissant. I don't care if they answer it. Frankly, I want it to ruminate. I want it to be a a pebble in their shoe, as Greg
Yeah.
Kugel would say, right?
Yeah.
I want it to worry them to death until they have to deal with it. The Holy Spirit does that. It isn't something I do.
Yes.
Something else that Alicia and Tim said, which I thought was very helpful on this issue, and that is not that one. It is this one.
Ah.
Questioners are looking for answers or exits.
Right.
I think that is very insightful. They're looking for answers or exits. If they can get answers, they'll stay, but they want real answers. If they're not getting answers, they're looking for a way out.
Yeah.
And so our task as dealing with those who are deconstructing is to develop answers, to recommend sources that they may consider. You were talking about James, about maybe because there's different people in churches and they all have different gifts and callings and sort of thing. I don't remember if you came to Big Tammy's Bible study, but we had someone I knew that asked me to teach a Bible study for 6 weeks, which ended up being 6 years. It was kind of interesting. And we had all manner of people kind of in and out there over that 6 year period, and we did different things. We had Seventh-day Baptists come in and we debated them. We had a couple of Jehovah's Witnesses come in one time and talk with them, and so we could have some real life experience of how this stuff works. And we had one woman who I loved her dearly. She didn't really understand what we were doing, but she was there faithfully every single week. She would meet you at the door, take your jacket if you had one, offer you a drink. She did all of the hospitality stuff. And if she didn't absorb all the stuff that needed to be absorbed, it didn't matter because she had a really interesting and important function in the group dynamic. And then when she was at work, if someone would ask her a question, she would go, "I don't know the answer to that, but I know who does."
Yeah.
And she would connect us. That was kind of her gift.
She was a networker.
She was definitely a networker, and she was very good at it. So we're not all going to be apologists. In fact, apologists need to really honor the networkers because they're doing an important function that we don't really do. You know, I'll fight as a drop of a hat, and I have a dozen hats to work with. So
Yes, you do. You sure do.
I sure do. So questioners are in fact, in this section, he talks about being seekers. The seeker-sensitive church, and he does point out earlier on that everybody is a seeker for truth or for self-gratification, but you're seeking for something. And questioners are looking for answers or exits. If you have answers, they want them. If you don't have answers, they are out the door.
Yep.
So we have about 6 minutes left. If anyone has questions, comments, something that we missed along the way.
No, I'm relating back to the church thingy. And in my life, my own personal life, I've gone to the church that I grew up when I was young and I first came to the Lord was one church. Then went to another one. I got married. Then went to another one. Then to that one was the last one, I think. No, it was like 4 churches in my lifetime of being a Christian over 50 years. Which because I didn't believe in just because something was going wrong that I had to leave that church. And I ended up realizing that no matter where I went, it was always going to be a problem of some kind. But each church and each type of congregation and each type of theology or doctrine that was taught, it started from kind of not so good, like very legalistic, like this guy had, and then it went up a little bit more, and then a little bit more, and each time I moved to another church, it sort of elevated the learning of what I had. So it was a church that I needed for that time in my life. I couldn't take stuff like this then. I would have been like, ah.
Sure, right.
And so eventually it got to a level where I was able to get to the point to understand. And then I finally got, in 1999, at the end of the, early 2000s, at the beginning of the year, to the Calvary in Elk Grove with Pastor Phil. And that church was the one where I realized this is where my journey has brought me to. And so from that point on, I mean, I had already known Don prior when I was in that other church before that, but I was asking questions then. So I was already kind of in that, like kind of that point where I was kind of getting there, like, okay, things are not looking quite right. I just don't know what it is.
Yeah,
and
right.
Then I would go and end up at your house for some of those studies that you had at your place and things like that. So it's a journey.
Yeah, that seems to me that it'd be interesting to find out of all these Christians that are deconstructing, how many have tried to find a different church that fit them better. I think that might be something, because I know 2 people right now that are struggling with that, and
Yeah.
I happen to know this one church isn't right for them because of where they're at, maybe, and I pointed that out, and they said, that's fantastic, and they decided to look and try something different, and they felt great about that. So
yeah,
not that they would have deconstructed, but it seems to me that would be a big thing to help the people.
Right. Because it all depends on your walk, where you're at in your walk.
Right.
So some churches will be okay at that point. Others, not so much.
Well,
exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it kind of does depend on why. If someone is unsatisfied and wanting another church, is it because they want more experience? I don't know. See, that's a little more difficult, because then you're leaving for experiential reasons, not because of any biblical reasons.
Exactly. That's the other side of the coin. Yes.
Yeah, that's the other side of the coin. So, and that's kind of a problem. Now, when we help people who've left abusive groups or cults or Gothard, for example, or something, we spend a little time kind of discipling them out of whatever it was they were in to kind of get them on a direction. And then when they're about ready to look for a church, sometimes it's soon, sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes it's a couple months. My next stop is to start calling churches in our area. If they don't know what to do next, then I might call churches and kind of quiz the pastors, which is always interesting.
Oh, I bet it is.
Because as I go through the process, some pastors will go, you just send them here, we'll take care of them. So thank you for your time, and I hang up when I go there. I'm not sending nobody there. On the other hand, I'll have pastors that'll say, I don't know how I would do that. I've never had this question before. I've never had someone who's been in a abusive group before. And I go, okay, if I recommend a book, will you read it? Oh, absolutely, I'll read it. I go, okay, that's the church I'm going to send somebody to, because he cares about what's going on, and he wants to take care of them well. I had one pastor. This is very funny. Greg Kemple. I think I told you about her. Greg, the Kemples. The 11-year-old is the one who ended up getting them out. Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah.
But I called some churches that were in our area, and I called one of the pastors, and I described who I am. Here's what we're doing. We have some Jehovah's Witnesses, the whole family of them, that are going to be looking for a church, and we're planning on coming to your church this Sunday. Are you good with that? I think so. He said, I never really had a Jehovah's Witness in my church. And I said, okay, well, they're not Jehovah's Witnesses. They have recently come to the faith, but they still have a lot of watchtower stuff in their brains.
Mm-hmm.
And so, are you going to be okay with that? And he said, I am, and I'm going to talk with the elders. We'll pray for them. Now, as it happened, and this is so funny because Jehovah's Witnesses are like anti-flag, anti-America,
Oh, yeah.
anti-blood, all that kind of stuff. And we go in, and one of the songs they're singing, "There's power in the blood." There's a big flag up on the back of the church. I mean, they hit all the wrong buttons.
You blew it.
Yeah.
And these poor Jadies are kind of slouching down in the
Right.
pew. I mean, it's just too much. Yeah. However, they did a weird thing on Tuesday morning when the pastor arrived at his office that Tuesday morning. The husband and wife showed up with legal-sized pads with tons of questions. And he called me later that day and he said, "What did you do to these people?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I haven't had to think about these things since I was in seminary."
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Were they good questions?" He goes, "Yeah, they were great questions." I said, "Okay, good. Did you answer?" It goes, "Yeah." I said, "Well, that's what they need."
Yeah, there you go. That's exactly it.
You know, the video that we start out with asks, "Is it okay to question your faith?" And
Right.
the answer that's implied is yes, if you do it the right way.
Right.
And
Right.
so, you know, the message is not that deconstructing is bad. We all have done it. Okay, none of us believes exactly the way we were first taught.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Right.
You know, I had this moment where I realized I'm not an anti-intellectual. I don't have to deal with that baggage anymore, and it's very liberating. I'm not. I'm not a legalist. I never realized that.
Mm-hmm.
There's another whole bunch of baggage that I can leave behind. I'm not a pietist. I don't think that the spiritual life is maintaining this artificial emotional state.
Right.
It has to do with following Jesus. You know, instead of constantly monitoring your inner workings of your psyche. Or, you know, it's like we go through these moments where we realized, you know, what we were originally taught wasn't 100% right, and we make these adjustments, and we get to a place where we have a more healthy, wholesome, and biblical faith.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we in the church should be helping everybody to do all the time. And if we can get the church back to functioning that way, then this is not going to be a problem. But as long as we keep raising people so they can't tell the baby from the bathwater, then we're going to continue to see that when they go through these things and realize, I got questions, I've got to rethink this, they're not going to come out in a good place because we haven't made it possible for them to do so.
Yeah.
So you were really all those things, huh? At one point, amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
I was an independent, fundamental, Bible-believing, busing Baptist. I came out of the Jack Hyles, what's the other guy's name? John R. Rice, that type of fundamentalism. You know, it was legalistic. It was a lot of things that, and yet, the core of the gospel was there.
Right.
You know, and so you really got to throw out the bathwater and keep the baby.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it's all about.
Absolutely.
And we all have to do it.
Yep.
Well,
Process.
we do, but and that is again, like you say, Dan. That's really part of the growing process where you're kind of sifting through things and changing and modifying and
Yes.
trying to see how this fits together. Um, and part of it really is, and I think this is an element where deconstructors have a difficult time, is recognizing the humanity of those who are around us and how that
Mm.
they can make mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
and expecting them to act in ways that they just are not able to.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't grant grace to one another sometimes.
Right.
And I have to tell you, I talk a lot about Norm Geisler. He was a very good friend. We enjoyed knowing him. I was honored to be his friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I know he had a reputation for being a fighter who would fight us to drop up a hat, and he would drop a hat. I mean, had a bad reputation. But I also know several other things about him. Part of that fighting aspect was that if he was your friend, he was going to defend you to the death, even if you were wrong. Now, he would confront you outside of the battle,
Right.
but he would never embarrass you in front of anybody.
Wow. Yeah.
So that was part of it. And he was a servant. I mean, you're at a conference, everybody's upstairs in the main room after lunch, and you just happen to pop downstairs and you find one guy down there cleaning the tables from what everyone left behind, and that's Norm Geisler. You don't think of him those terms, So he taught me about servanthood. He taught me about sometimes turning on the blessing button if you're in a church that gets a little off kilter occasionally.
Yeah.
He taught Joy and I a lot of. He exhibited something that you rarely see, and that is making sure that if a female is in your vicinity trying to listen on a discussion, that you draw them in. He was a master at that.
Mm.
We'd be at a conference, and Joy and I would be standing kind of on the outside, and all of the acolytes would be around Norm, kind of getting his attention or whatever. And he'd look up and he'd say, "Joy, what do you think about that?" And there would all of a sudden the waves would part. The men would step aside because Norm reached out to her.
Right.
There's a meaningful things, and deconstructors need to see churches operating that way.
Yeah.
Because everybody is important.
He was purposeful in what he did.
Right. Yeah.
Very much. And in a good way.
All right, crew. Next week it is
the
Don W is on the hot seat.
Oh, yes. Back to that again.
Yep. You want to do that next week, or you want to hold it off a week?
We can do it next week.
Next week we're doing it. 95 Theses for a New Reformation. If you don't have the book, go get the book on Amazon. Or if you want a signed copy, how much will you sell them a signed copy for?
$20.
How much?
20.
20?
Yeah,
20. That'll cover shipping.
Pay Amazon 25. Give me 25, and that'll include the postage.
Okay. So if you want to buy it from Don W, and have him sign it for you, he will be glad to do that for $25. Or you can order it on Amazon. 95 Theses for a New Reformation, Don Williams. That's where we're starting next week, and it is one of the most important books, I think, for churches, leadership especially, to read. We've been through it, twice now, Jeff and I. 3, this will be third time, actually.
3 times.
Yeah, so we just finished it at our church as well. So
nice.
It's a very important book.
We're going to go from deconstructing to reconstructing.
Yeah.
To reconstructing. So the timing. In fact, I think Crystal mentioned that we're going from deconstructing to reconstructing. What is the faith?
Perfect. Can't wait.
So we will see you all next week. Thank you for joining us. And Naomi, I'm glad you enjoyed this, and Jennifer and Krista, of course, she's right there. Come back and join us.
Come back
Blessings.
soon. Bye.